My parents decided to take my younger sister, Jessica, on vacation instead of me. Later on, she managed to ruin the whole trip and even got herself arrested. Now, my parents are finally starting to see what I have been telling them for years. I am Emily, 23 years old, and I have an 18-year-old sister, Jessica, who I honestly believe might be one of the most manipulative people on the planet. For years, I tried to make my parents see what she was really like, but they never listened to me until now. To give you some background, my relationship with my parents has always been a bit strained, and most of that is because of Jessica. My parents adore her, to the point of blindness, because my mom had a miscarriage before Jessica was born. It was a devastating experience for them, and when Jessica came along a few years later, they saw her as their miracle baby. To them, she was the light that brought them hope after a dark time. They doted on her, gave her endless attention, and made her the center of our family's world. I want to be clear, when we were kids, I loved Jessica. She was my little sister, and I wanted the best for her. But over time, I started noticing things about her that no one else in the family seemed to see. Jessica had this uncanny ability to twist situations in her favor. She was like a professional victim, always finding ways to make herself look innocent while causing chaos for others. There was this one time, on my birthday, when my grandparents gave me this beautiful antique pocket watch. It was a family heirloom, and my grandmother told me how much it meant to her. I was over the moon about it, but Jessica? She was jealous, plain and simple. She kept asking if she could have it or at least share it. I told her no, it was a gift for me. She tried to get our parents involved, but since it was from our grandparents, there was nothing they could do. That night, Jessica pulled one of her signature moves. She knew I was terrified of spiders, so she put a house spider in my pillowcase. When I climbed into bed, I felt something crawling on my skin. I screamed so loud that my parents came rushing into my room. Jessica, of course, acted like she was just as horrified as I was. Later, when we were alone, she grinned at me and admitted she had done it to teach me a lesson. She said it so casually, like it was no big deal. I could not believe it. Another time, when I was in high school, I had a crush on this guy named Ryan. After weeks of mustering up the courage, I invited him over to watch a movie. I dressed up a bit, feeling excited but nervous. The moment Ryan walked through the door, Jessica accidentally spilled a glass of juice all over my dress. I was humiliated and had to go upstairs to change, leaving Ryan alone with her. When I came back, she was telling him all these embarrassing stories about me from when I was a kid. She would not leave us alone the entire time he was there. As he was leaving, she smirked and told him, "You can do way better than my sister." Ryan looked uncomfortable the entire time and never talked to me again. Over the years, I tried to tell my parents about Jessica's behavior. Every time, they brushed it off, saying she was young and did not know better. They thought I was overreacting or just trying to cause trouble. Eventually, I gave up. Jessica was their golden child, and I was just the problem child who could not let things go. When I graduated high school, I worked hard to get into a good college, which gave me the chance to move out. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. But every time I came home during breaks, Jessica made it clear that I was not welcome. She would barely talk to me, and when she did, it was to make snide remarks or interrupt me while I was talking to our parents. At family meals, she would sit as far away from me as possible or find some way to make me feel invisible. It was like she wanted me to know that I was not part of the family anymore. Jessica also had a habit of messing with my stuff. She would borrow things without asking and either ruin them or lose them. When I tried to complain to my parents, they told me to stop being so dramatic and to get along with her. After a while, I stopped going home as much. I made excuses to spend holidays with friends, and my parents never seemed to mind. They chalked it up to me being independent. When Jessica graduated high school, she did not have the grades for a university, so she went to community college. This meant she never moved out, and my parents continued to coddle her. Meanwhile, I started working a great job in Chicago, and I rarely visited home. I stayed in touch with my parents, but I kept my distance from Jessica. She never reached out to me, and I was fine with that. Jessica always had a habit of messing with my things, claiming she needed to borrow them, only to either damage or lose them. When I tried to bring it up to my parents, they brushed it off, telling us to learn how to get along. It became exhausting to deal with her antics, so I started avoiding coming home during my college breaks. I found ways to spend those breaks with friends and their families instead. Honestly, my parents did not seem to mind much. They told themselves that I was just being independent and enjoying time away. When Jessica finished high school, she did not have the grades for university, so she ended up going to the local community college. That meant she stayed at home, enjoying the comfort of our parents' constant attention. Meanwhile, I was starting my career at a multinational corporation in Seattle, and I loved my job. I stayed in touch with my parents occasionally, but I rarely visited home, and I made no effort to stay in contact with Jessica. Then the real story began. My father had a near-fatal heart attack. By some miracle, he survived and was rushed to the hospital just in time. When my mom called to tell me, I dropped everything and flew back home immediately. The doctors prescribed a strict regimen of medications and advised my dad to start exercising regularly. After he was discharged, he started talking about how grateful he was to be alive and how much he wanted to spend more time with the family. I could see where he was coming from. After such a close call, I understood why family time felt so important to him. I decided to stay for a few days to support him. Since my job allows me to work remotely, it was no problem. However, Jessica seemed visibly annoyed by my presence. I kept my distance from her, not wanting to stir up any arguments, especially after what my dad had just been through. One morning, during breakfast, my dad suggested that we all go on a family vacation. He said it had been years since we had gone anywhere together, and he thought it would be good for us. I hesitated at first but eventually agreed because I could tell how much it meant to him. Jessica, on the other hand, was not thrilled about the idea, but since it was my dad's plan, she reluctantly went along with it. My dad took charge of booking the flights and accommodations. I arranged my time off work, letting my colleagues know I would be unavailable, so I could focus on spending quality time with my parents. The day of the trip came, and we arrived at the airport. That is when I discovered that my flight ticket had been cancelled. Confused, I turned to my dad, who was just as puzzled as I was. He insisted that he had booked and paid for all 4 tickets. When we checked further, it turned out that, out of all the tickets, the one with my name on it had been mysteriously cancelled. As I stood there trying to process what had happened, I noticed Jessica standing nearby with a smug smile on her face. It was a look I knew all too well, the same look she always had when she pulled one of her manipulative stunts. I realized then and there that she was behind it. She must have cancelled my ticket from my dad's computer. I confronted her, yelling in frustration, but she just stood there, grinning like she had one. I turned to my parents, desperate for them to see what was happening. I told them Jessica had cancelled my ticket because she never wanted me to join this trip in the first place. But instead of believing me, my mom immediately dismissed my accusation. "Your sister would never do something like that," she said, as if the very idea was ridiculous. She even scolded me, saying I was just being jealous of Jessica. My dad chimed in, saying it might have been an airline mistake, and I should not jump to conclusions. I was furious and heartbroken. How could they not see what was so obvious? Their beloved miracle child had deliberately sabotaged my plans, and they still refused to believe it. At that point, there was nothing I could do. The ticket was already cancelled, and there were no available flights for the rest of the day. Sure, I could have booked another flight for the next day, but the thought of traveling alone after all this felt unbearable. This was supposed to be a family trip, and now it felt like anything but. I was not exactly looking forward to sharing a room with Jessica on this trip. I had hoped, maybe foolishly, that she had grown up a bit over the years, but if she had been behind canceling my flight ticket, I could only imagine what other plans she might have to ruin the vacation for me. My father seemed unsure at first, even suggesting that we cancel the trip and plan another one later. But soon, he started talking about how it had been years since he had gone on vacation, and my mother chimed in, saying, "You travel a lot for work anyway, so missing this trip shouldn't be a big deal for you." Their words hit me hard. It felt like they wanted me to insist they go on the vacation without me. So, I told them, "You are welcome to go without me." To my disappointment, they agreed without hesitation. Although I did not want them to waste the money they had spent on tickets and accommodations, it hurt to realize how little they cared whether I joined them or not. It became painfully clear that they were fine with going as a family of 3. So there I was, standing alone at the airport, watching my parents and Jessica head off on their much-anticipated vacation. I decided to head back to my place in Denver instead of staying at the family house, which felt too lonely and full of memories I was not ready to confront. I tried to put the incident behind me, focusing on enjoying the rest of the leave I had already taken from work. I reconnected with some old friends and spent my time diving into books, turning the break into a solo staycation. During their vacation, my parents occasionally video called me. They looked happy and seemed to be having a great time. It was obvious that my absence had not affected their trip in the slightest. I was not heartbroken about missing the vacation itself, but I could not help feeling excluded. It was yet another reminder of the favoritism that had always been so deeply rooted in our family dynamic. I had always hoped that one day they would see Jessica for who she really was. That wish came true, though not in a way I could have ever anticipated. A few days into their trip, I woke up to several missed calls from my mother. My heart sank, thinking something terrible had happened to my dad. I called her back immediately. Thankfully, she answered, but she sounded extremely upset. I asked her what was wrong, and that is when she told me about something deeply troubling. Apparently, my parents had noticed that my dad's essential heart medications were disappearing a little more each day. My dad's health was still fragile, and missing even a single dose could be life-threatening. Being in a foreign country, they were unsure if they could find the same medication there. They searched their room thoroughly but found nothing. At some point, my mother decided to borrow sunscreen from Jessica's room while she was out. That was when she stumbled upon all of my dad's missing medications, carefully hidden in Jessica's bedside table. My mother was horrified and immediately called my father. He rushed over and confirmed that the pills Jessica had taken were the ones he needed. It was a chilling realization for both of them. For the first time, they saw the lengths Jessica was willing to go to endanger my dad's health, no less, all for reasons that only she could justify. My mother's voice shook as she asked me if they should confront Jessica about this. I told her not to address it until they returned home. I explained that confronting Jessica in the middle of the trip would likely escalate things and make it even harder to reason with her. Jessica had always been a master at manipulating situations, and she would surely find a way to twist the blame back onto them. Despite my advice, it seemed like things came to a head sooner than expected. Late one night, I got a call from my father. His voice was trembling as he informed me that Jessica was in jail. I was stunned. He explained that they had confronted her about the medications, and she had gone into one of her infamous tantrums. She screamed at my dad, accusing him of ruining her life by booking me on the trip in the first place. She said she would make them pay if they continued to have a relationship with me. Her rage escalated to the point where she started throwing things, and eventually, the hotel staff had no choice but to call the police. Jessica refused to calm down, and when the officers arrived, she insulted them repeatedly. That was enough for them to arrest her on charges of disorderly conduct. Jessica was held for 24 hours, but there was little my parents could do in the meantime. Desperate to leave after everything that had happened, my parents tried to reschedule their flight home. That is when they discovered that their passports and wallets were missing. It turns out Jessica had hidden or discarded their passports, leaving them stranded in a foreign country with no identification or money. This was the first time I think my parents truly understood who Jessica was. My mother, who had defended her endlessly over the years, called me in tears, begging for help. She admitted that they had no way to return home without their documentation or finances. The realization of what Jessica had done and who she had become had left my mother shattered. I could hear the regret in her voice as she grappled with the truth about her so-called angelic daughter. I assured my parents not to worry and promised to send them money through Western Union so they could manage while stranded. However, I emphasized they had to locate their passports first before they could return home. I was confident that Jessica had not destroyed them, just hidden them in one of her twisted games. My parents, now finally seeing the truth of her manipulative nature, expressed genuine gratitude that I was stepping in to help, even after they had excluded me from this vacation. They also apologized for their past behavior. While part of me wanted to forgive them, the years of being sidelined and overlooked because of their favoritism toward Jessica made it hard to let go of the resentment. I could not help but wonder, am I wrong for struggling to forgive my parents? They chose to go on this trip without me, and now, after experiencing Jessica's true colors, they turn to me for help. Every day, my parents called with updates, and with each call, my anxiety about their situation grew. After Jessica was released from jail the following day, my parents finally had enough and threatened to call the police again unless she gave them their passports. Left with no other option, Jessica reluctantly revealed where she had hidden them. Once they returned home, my parents confronted Jessica and firmly told her she had to pack her belongings and leave. They had reached their breaking point and realized just how toxic her behavior had become. My father's health was too fragile for them to risk another incident like the one during the vacation. What followed was another one of Jessica's signature outbursts. She screamed accusations at them, insisting they only had room in their lives for her and that inviting me on the trip had driven her to the brink. She demanded that they disown me, repeatedly saying that she was all they needed. The depth of her jealousy and resentment toward me finally became clear to my parents. As they tried to reason with her, Jessica's anger only intensified. In desperation, she threatened to spread lies about them to their community, accusing them of neglecting her as a child and mistreating her during her formative years. She even said she would go to the police and file false reports against them if they continued to push her to move out. My parents were terrified by the possibility of their reputation being destroyed, especially since they are respected professionals in our town. In the following days, Jessica made their lives even harder. When she found out they were talking to me regularly, she flew into a rage. She started breaking dishes in anger and, worse, began stealing their car keys and hiding them, making it nearly impossible for them to get to work. Just last night, my mother called me in tears after yet another incident. Jessica had thrown a tantrum at dinner because she wanted my mother to cook for her. When my mom refused, exhausted from a long day at work, Jessica went on a rampage, smashing furniture around the house. Afterward, she retreated to her room and blasted music so loud that my parents could not sleep. The situation had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. It was taking a severe toll on my parents emotionally and mentally. I had hoped they would finally recognize Jessica's true nature, but now I feared she posed a real danger to them. Returning home myself was not an option, as it would only add fuel to Jessica's fire and lead to more explosive confrontations. As some of you predicted, Jessica's behavior eventually reached a breaking point. One night, during a heated argument, she came at my parents with a knife. This horrifying escalation left them with no choice but to call the police. The officers arrived quickly and arrested her on charges of assault. With Jessica in custody, my parents realized it was time to make a permanent change. They sought advice from an attorney, who walked them through the legal process of evicting her. Though it was a painful decision, they knew it was the only way to protect themselves and restore some peace in their lives. While my parents chose not to press further charges against Jessica, they made it clear that she had to leave. After bailing her out of jail, they handed her a formal eviction notice. It outlined all the legal reasons she needed to move out and specified a deadline for when she had to be gone. They took every precaution to ensure the process was by the book, leaving Jessica no room to challenge their actions in court. Next, my parents went to court with their lawyer to officially begin the eviction process. This meant filing a lawsuit against Jessica. It was one of the hardest decisions they had ever made, knowing they were taking legal action against their own daughter. They felt heartbroken, guilty, and as though they had failed her somehow, but they understood they had no other choice. The court eventually issued an official order stating that Jessica had to leave the house. If she refused to go willingly, my parents would have the legal right to have her removed from the property. Jessica is now set to be out by next week. For the first time in a long while, my parents can finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing they have taken a step toward reclaiming their home and their peace. It has been an exhausting journey, but they remain hopeful that life will begin to improve once Jessica moves out. Throughout this ordeal, I have stayed in close contact with my parents. I even invited them to come to Denver for a few weeks as soon as the situation at home was resolved. I felt they deserved a break after everything they had endured. I wanted them to relax, get away from the stress Jessica had caused, and spend some quality time with me. It also gave me a chance to offer my support and help them find some much-needed stability. I have received countless messages and comments from people offering advice, and many suggested that Jessica might need a mental health evaluation. While it is something we have considered, there is a significant challenge. Jessica is an adult, and we cannot force her to seek help unless she agrees to it willingly. Given her history of violent outbursts, we also do not want to risk escalating the situation further by pushing her too hard. As I mentioned in my last update, my parents eventually came to Denver to stay with me for a few days. Yesterday evening, we sat together around my dining table, and for the first time, my parents opened up to me in a way they never had before. Their voices were heavy with humility and regret. My father admitted that he had been blind to Jessica's true nature for years and expressed deep remorse for not listening to my warnings earlier. He confessed that he had never imagined Jessica could become so manipulative and harmful and that he had failed to see past the charming facade she always presented. My mother, echoing his sentiments, acknowledged how wrong she had been to dismiss my concerns all those years. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the pain she felt, realizing how their favoritism toward Jessica had isolated and hurt me. Hearing this was bittersweet. I appreciated their honesty and the effort they were making to seek my forgiveness, but it was also hard to relive the pain I had endured because of their choices. I shared some of the most difficult memories from the years of torment I experienced at Jessica's hands. My parents sat in stunned silence, shocked at how much I had suffered on my own. They repeatedly apologized and admitted that their unwavering devotion to Jessica had clouded their judgment. They explained that because Jessica had been their unexpected miracle baby, they had overlooked so many red flags in her behavior. With sincerity in their voices, they begged for my forgiveness for all the years they had failed me. It was a pivotal moment for our family, one that I had hoped for but never thought would come. While it may not have been the perfect way to mend our relationship, it was the beginning of a much-needed conversation that brought clarity to the dysfunction that had plagued us for so long. I told them that forgiveness would take time and that rebuilding my trust would not happen overnight. Still, we agreed to work through things together. For now, I am focusing on enjoying the time I have with them while they are here. As the days passed, we spent more time together, exploring the bustling streets of Denver, savoring good food, and simply enjoying one another's company. It has been a journey of rediscovery, reconnecting, and slowly rebuilding the bonds that had been damaged by years of denial and favoritism. Through our time together, I came to understand that my parents' decision to spend time with me was about more than just escaping Jessica. It was their way of seeking a fresh start for our family, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. And truthfully, I needed that fresh start just as much as they did. We have since discussed what should happen next with Jessica. She is currently staying with a friend, and while it would be easy to cut ties, my parents feel a deep sense of responsibility toward her. Despite all the pain she has caused, they are still her parents and cannot simply abandon her. We now suspect that Jessica's behavior might not solely be willful mischief but could point to deeper psychological issues. My parents and I plan to explore the possibility of a mental health evaluation to understand what might be driving her actions. However, since Jessica is an adult, we cannot force her to seek help. Instead, we are looking for ways to encourage her to do so voluntarily. My parents have decided to reach out to Jessica once they return home to discuss the situation. I have chosen not to contact her directly, as she still harbors resentment toward me, and I do not want to risk worsening the situation. For their safety, I have urged my parents to meet Jessica in a public place, where she would be less likely to lash out in anger. Our primary goal is to help Jessica see our perspective and, more importantly, to show her that we still care about her well-being. This is not about blame, it is about coming together as a family to address the challenges that have caused so much damage to our relationships.